Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast here with Mr. Davis. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. My name is Steve Davis, and I'm the co-author of The Most Dangerous Man in America, Timothy Leary, Richard Nixon, and The Hunt for the Fugitive King of LSD. I think that's the subtitle.
The King of LSD. So who is Timothy Leary?
Oh, Timothy Leary was really one of the great shining stars of the 1960s. He had been a professor at Harvard University, and he was a psychologist. And at one point, he was recruited into trying some magic mushrooms in Mexico as a middle-aged man. And when he did these mushrooms, his experience was such that he said, "I learned more about the workings of the human mind in the few hours on these mushrooms that I had in my entire career studying, in academia." And he became a proselytizer for LSD, as our subtitle is mentions, the king of LSD. Timothy Leary, basically the 1960s generation, you had people who were rebelling against Vietnam, people who were rebelling against segregation. You had the country really questioning its values as young people came of age. And LSD was kind of the sacrament of the times in a way. Timothy Leary saw it as a way to free your mind from the shackles that had been constrained on you by society and the way the society trained you to go out and basically, work for a corporation for a living and drive cars, buy a home, and all that kind of stuff. And his idea was that this would free you and make you a better citizen of the universe in some ways, because you'd be plugged into everything and everyone, the great cosmic television, as he called it. But so Leary became, his big mantra was turn on, tune in, and drop out. And, he spoke at festivals. He was a countercultural icon, really. And because of the influence he had, again, this was a Harvard professor at the time. He was later dismissed by Harvard. But this Harvard professor is saying LSD is the greatest experience that you can have in your life. And hey, I do it all the time. And look at me, and having this person speak to young people really freaked out a lot of parents and older people and law enforcement people, and ultimately the president of the United States in those years.
What was the fear with just LSD? If it's this thing that, Timothy Leary's preaching from the top of the church steps or something, that it's this altering drug and this is freeing thing. I mean, I guess I could see why Harvard might fire him because of that, just because you can't have, an academic doing drugs, especially one that's kind of, I mean, is it known back then LSD is? I knew the government knew about it for a while, but I'm just curious to how long the general public was actually associated with this.
Oh, sure. That's a great question. And, LSD was actually, it's a synthetic. It was a compound that was synthesized by a Swiss chemist during World War II. Like a few months before the atomic bomb was developed. And there's a synchronicity there I'll get back to in just a moment. Um, but so basically, LSD was seen as this very powerful hallucinogenic, this substance that in clinical trials people were using. The actor Cary Grant, if you're familiar with him, was somebody who was using LSD for therapy. Time magazine, this is in the 1950s, was running stories about this new kind of miracle drug that might cure depression and other things. And so people were making use of it in very controlled and clinical settings. And it was really basically being used by a fairly elite group of people at that time. Just like psychedelic therapy is now, which is, we know a lot more about psychedelics and how they should be applied. So Timothy Leary came in and basically opened up LSD to the masses. And the idea is that at that point there were a lot of campaigns of fear about the drug, because if you think about it, what does the establishment want? What do parents and old people want? They want order. They're interested in order and control. And this drug, which offered personal liberation, was very destabilizing. And, and honestly, there are people who had psychotic reactions to LSD. It's a very dangerous drug used in an unregulated setting. And Timothy Leary, he always preached, set and setting. And the idea is you're supposed to have trusted guides to help you navigate these very terrifying trips because, I think probably most of the people watching and listening understand what LSD does, but essentially it dissolves your ego and the persona that you built around yourself your whole life basically gets blown out, and so you have this feeling that you're dying, that everything is falling apart, and so it's a terrifying experience, and it's actually a shamanic experience. It's a experience that humans have had and have craved to have for thousands of years through various natural substances. On every continent, there are psychedelic substances that create the same kinds of experiences. LSD is a very power. It's like an atomic bomb version of these substances. So it caused a lot of fear in that regard. And since I mentioned the atomic bomb early on, let me say too that the LSD's adherents believed that it would change human consciousness in a way that we needed to evolve, so that we were no longer these war monkeys, fixate on gaining possessions and all fighting each other and having these ongoing wars, but we would see how everybody and everything and all life was interconnected, and we would in turn uh, worship nature instead of just like trampling on nature, and
The
we would
creation of AI.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So yeah, it was threatening to a lot of people, and there are all the horror stories, the scare stories are out there. People jumping out of windows or whatever, this and that, um, all greatly magnified, of course. But the idea was to create terror about this substance to keep people from using it.
When did it become on Nixon's radar? Like, when did Nixon decide that Timothy Leary was this person that we had to get rid of, or we had to basically hunt down in a sense? Like, I know about Operation Midnight Climax. I don't know if you were familiar with that, which was
Can you tell us a bit about that?
I heard that from Tom O'Neill when he was talking about his book Chaos, and they talked about these. It was in San Francisco, I think, where they were drugging people in random like brothels and things, and the
With
people.
the two-way mirrors, I guess, right, where they could observe them. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I guess that's what they said it, but I think it was a thing for the anti-hippie movement, if I'm not mistaken, which people were associating these people that were losing their minds on drugs, and they were associating that with the hippies. And it leads into like to an activism thing. Like I said, I don't have all the conclusive evidence if that's 100% true or not. I believe that there's many reasons to go to war, and there's many reasons to people that can be activists and things of that sort. But that was just something that I heard. Operation Midnight Climax, and then about MK Ultra with LSD as well too.
Yeah, and getting back to Midnight Climax, yeah, LSD was used on unsuspecting people who had no idea they had been dosed, and that certainly you would think that you were losing your mind if that happened. And I don't know if you're familiar with the novelist Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
I've heard of the book, yeah.
Yeah, he actually was a graduate student at Stanford in creative writing and volunteered to take part in experimental drug, which turned out to be LSD. So it was being given to graduate students. And Kesey actually basically used that experience to write his book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So, yes, the government actually was putting the drug out there for people. And there is this, I don't know if you would call it quite a conspiracy theory, but I think you could call it a theory definitely worth considering because the government was putting it out there, that it was put out there to destabilize the left, the people who were opposed to Vietnam and people who were for civil rights, to basically fracture the left.
I've seen the documents on it, and if you Google Operation Midnight Climax, it'll tell you exactly what I just said, which is like it's not labeled under conspiracy. It doesn't say conspiracy in it. And the references are to some people who talked about I think it's prisoners who've written books about prisoners that were being experimented with LSD, and homeless people as well too. And then also people in insane asylums, because nobody's going to believe a person who's mentally insane that the government's drugging you. And it's just like even when you talk about it and you're looking at the document, it just sounds so nuts where it's just like yeah, I would label it as conspiracy. I think MK Ultra was labeled like that for a long time until they had hearings on it.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm not using the term conspiracy because I think conspiracy theory automatically conjures up this whole world of
The earth is flat.
fanciful connections. I think there are, yeah, serious questions about what was going on there. So that's my point. Yeah.
When did it become on Nixon's radar, like Timothy Leary?
So Timothy Leary, like I said, he was a counterculture icon. I mean, he was a big star of the 1960s. There were songs about him. He was famous. Wherever he went, he appeared at places like the Human Bee Inn in San Francisco, and that's where he said, turn on, tune in, drop out. Um, and so Leary was a huge fat target for the government for a long time. And he got busted for pot, in Texas, crossing the border from Mexico. He got busted for a couple of joints in California, and this was in the late 1960s, 1969, basically. And when he got busted for those two joints, he was sentenced essentially to 10 years to life in prison. And he was about 50 years old then. And so he felt that was basically going to be a life sentence for him to spend the rest of his life in the penitentiary. And Nixon was president. Nixon had been elected in 1968. And Nixon, you know, was Nixon and his people saw the enemies as minorities and the young people, because those are the people who were not voting for Nixon. They, talked about the great silent majority, which were the white middle class Americans and working class Americans they thought would support Nixon. And so Nixon and his people went hard after their enemies. Nixon had a whole enemies list. And so, when Nixon was escalating the war in Vietnam in May 1970, that's when you had the shooting at Kent State and all these protests across the country in response. So Nixon was paranoid and fearful in a lot of ways. I'll mention the Weather Underground was active at that time. This was the dissident youth movement that was actually planting bombs in government buildings around the country. These are bombs that were not targeted at humans, but targeted at government targets symbolically to draw attention to the Vietnam War and things like that. So there was just a lot of domestic turmoil and violence in 1969, 1970. You had the concert at Altamont where the Rolling Stones performed, where the Hells Angels killed James Meredith. I mean, it was just the early dream of the 60s, this peace and love that you saw at Woodstock and everything, that turned pretty quickly into a really nightmarish vision with Charles Manson, the just violence unfolding across the country, bombings and everything else. And this is the context in which Timothy Leary was sentenced to basically a life term and put away. And people saw this as a way for the government to get rid of this guy who was a real symbolic leader of the counterculture. So Tim Leary was in this prison in California. And, Nixon really, he heard his name, but he had no particular fascination with Timothy Leary. But then Timothy Leary did something he wasn't supposed to do, and that is he escaped. He escaped from this prison, and the people who helped plot the escape were members of the Weather Underground, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. And they broke Leary out of prison in, I believe it was May 1970. I'm not sure my dates are accurate right now, but Leary, and it's a great escape. We cover this in our book actually, because there's a lot of declassified material now we got from the government, and we got from Timothy Leary's own archives and his own recollections of what happened. But yeah, so he broke out of this prison, and the interesting thing is that when Leary was spirited away, he assumed that he would be sent to Hawaii or Costa Rica, or some kind of idyllic place to ride out the rest of his life until it's safe to come back to America. And the people who broke him out, the Weather Underground, had made an alliance with the Black Panthers. And the Black Panthers are a separatist group that began in Oakland in response to police violence. The conditions then are not much different than they are today, honestly. And the leader of the Black Panthers was one of the leaders. Huey Newton was in that same prison with Tim Leary, but another leader was a guy named Eldridge Cleaver. Have you ever heard his name?
Mm-mm.
Eldridge Cleaver was, he had written a great book called Soul on Ice about his experiences growing up African American in the United States. And it's just a brutally honest and penetrating memoir. Soul on Ice was like one of the counterculture Bibles of the 1960s. And Eldridge Cleaver was on the bestseller list with that book. And one of the things we say in our book, The Most Dangerous Man in America, is that Cleaver was probably the only person in American history who was simultaneously on the bestseller list and on America's most wanted list, because Eldridge Cleaver was wanted for killing a cop, basically, in Oakland. Um, and the Panthers began as a self-help group. They patrolled the streets to protect their people from police violence, and there were armed confrontations with the cops and so forth. Anyway, Eldridge Cleaver ended up having to flee America, and he found safe refuge in a country called, well, it was in Algeria, and he was in the capital, Algiers. And the Algerian government at that time was basically socialist leaning. They had recently gotten their independence from France. And the Algerian government did not recognize the United States government. They did not recognize Richard Nixon as the legitimate representative of the American people. They refused to. Instead, they recognized the Black Panthers as the legitimate representatives of the American people. So the Black Panthers had their own embassy in Algiers. And Eldridge Cleaver was called Mr. Ambassador there. And there's a contingent of these people who had grown up on the streets of Oakland who were living in Algeria and had this beautiful villa, which was their embassy there. So when the Weather Underground broke Tim Leary out of prison, they told him, we're not sending you to Costa Rica, we're not sending you to Hawaii, we're sending you to Algeria under the protection of our brothers, the Black Panthers. So that's where Timothy Leary went next. But to get back to your question you asked a few minutes ago about what got Nixon obsessed, this all happened, as I said, when turmoil was just rationing up across America. Nixon was wanting to go hard after all of his domestic enemies. They wanted to just suppress and just beat the hell out of anybody they could who they saw as an opponent. And this was around the time where Nixon thought, and his advisors, frankly, thought, a war on drugs would be a great thing, because that way we could basically militarize our assault on all these enemies that we have. And the young people, the hippies, the protesters, they're all using drugs. We can criminalize the hell out of this stuff and just lock them all up, basically. And so you have this huge counterculture star who had this famous breakout of prison and is on the lam. That is the guy who is the natural target for you to go after. So Nixon and his administration made it their personal vendetta to go grab Tim Leary and put him back behind bars. And that basically played out for the next 28 months. And that's what we cover in our book, that period.
How public was Timothy Leary escaping and just breaking out of prison to the point where Nixon could have just let him go and then focused on the war at home? But it seemed like a little bit more than that. And if you know about Nixon, his ego, his kind of personality in a sense is like that would be seen as a slight and a spit on his shoes rather than just like he's got to make a statement out of this guy that just broke out of jail. We can't let that go through.
Sure. And, when Tim Leary broke out of prison, that was front page news across the country. This is like, it's like, I'm trying to think of an equivalent today, but, let's say like some Hollywood celebrity gets locked up for some reason, they break out of prison. Yeah, you would hear about it. And the idea was that if Tim Leary was able to go free, then that was basically, flouting the US government and thumbing his nose at Nixon. So you not only wanted to bring him back to justice, or what they would call justice, but you would want to make an example of this guy. So that was what they did. They J. Edgar Hoover was summoned to the White House, and he told Nixon, "We'll have him in 10 days." And the escape itself was actually quite clever, because the Weather Underground, you have to understand, these are like really, really smart college kids who basically used all of their intelligence to plan these operations. And so they had planned out Leary's escape very well. And when they picked up Tim Leary, they drove him north, right? And the first thing he did was cut his hair and dye his hair. And they had him in a camper with another guy and a fishing rod, actually with a family. So it was like family on vacation. But they took his clothes from the prison and put them in another car, and they headed south towards Mexico, where Ken Kesey, who I mentioned earlier, had escaped to Mexico. That's where people normally went, was to Mexico to get away. This car headed south towards Mexico. They dumped all of his prison clothes into a garbage can in a gas station, like 3 or 4 miles south of town. So, everybody was like looking down south. And Tim Leary, meanwhile, was heading up to Seattle, basically, where they had the safe house. So, anyway,
That's so interesting though, because like I know a little bit about the Weather Underground and the Microdot Gang. I know just I mean, it's like I said, I'm so disconnected because I'm from, kind of young eyes looking into this part of history. I mean, even some people have to look into a lot of the specifics of this. Like, did your perspective change writing this book and seeing all the declassified like I've talked to John Potash, who wrote about Tupac Shakur and the FBI, and then I've talked to Brad Schreiber, who's wrote Reverend's End and a couple books that talk about like more of like the conspiracy side of things, which is where I do fall in with the MK Ultra and the druggings and all that. But you just start learning. Like I had to dive into learning about Nixon's administration and his conflicts with J. Edgar Hoover, then the change that started to happen after J. Edgar Hoover died. And it's like, I don't know. I don't know what to believe at this point. It's because I'm like, people have a lot of documents to back up their things, but also like, I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting revved up.
yeah. No, I think you're right to be suspicious. And I'll say it was hard for me to be surprised because one of my earlier books was about a fairly innocuous person in Texas, this old folklorist and writer, a guy named J. Frank Dobie, who was, as pro American as you could get. But Dobie, who was coming of age in the 1930s and 40s, he was calling for the integration of the University of Texas at Austin, where he taught in the 1940s. Okay. And that was, 10 years before Brown v. Board, 20 years before the university actually desegregated. In response to him calling for the integration of the university, he got fired, of course, by UT because that's what they did back then. But just for the hell of it, I was like, I wonder if there's any FBI records on J. Frank Dobie, who had served in World War I. He had taught for the U.S. Army in Europe during World War II. This is a guy who, I mean, his patriotism cannot be questioned. He was with the U.S. Army. He went behind Soviet lines and saw Hitler's bunker before it was destroyed. He toured Auschwitz. He was at the Nuremberg trials, And what I found was, oh my God, there were like 70 pages of FBI documents on this fairly innocuous person because he had called for integration. And the FBI had plotted to harass this guy. They had investigated him. They'd gone around and questioned his colleagues and made insinuating comments about his loyalty to America. And I thought to myself, my God, if they went after somebody like Dobie this hard, what would they do to anybody else? And of course, people you've talked to have indicated such. So when you have somebody like Timothy Leary, who was a huge fat target for the US government, it's hard to be surprised by anything that the government would have done at that time, particularly under a criminal like Richard Nixon, who used the office, for criminal purposes. It was hard for me to be surprised. But I will say, despite all that, yes, I was surprised by things. And one of the things I was surprised by is how Nixon and the US government was so desperate to get Leary back on United States soil and back behind bars that they were actually willing to sacrifice some of their geopolitical goals in order to make that happen. They're willing to rankle allies in Europe, and they're willing to upset like delicate situations in the Middle East, all to get Leary back. And I was surprised by that because I thought they'd be more uh, tactical and strategic oriented than just letting a personal vendetta kind of careen around the policy of the entire United States government and its foreign policy to grab this guy. That was surprising to see how personal it became and how that colored their judgment.
Did you come across any documents of anybody trying to communicate with Leary and see if, because one thing that I with MK Ultra is you notice like Sidney Gottlieb, Julian West, they all worked at college institutions, Harvard, Yale, and they were psychiatrists. So it seemed like this was like a common like Timothy Leary, the way you described him in the beginning, working as a psychologist, like you just have this aspect of like, well, he fits the perfect description of a perfect candidate that they would have on their team. So it's so weird how it's the complete opposite unless they had tried communicating with him before.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. Are you asking if Timothy Leary was a double agent?
I'm asking if Timothy Leary had been, you came across any documents where he might have been messaged or someone tried to talk to him or anything like that.
Um, let's, here's what I can, say. Timothy Leary was arguably a very negative force in a few ways. Um, One was that if you think about what the goals of the 1960s were, to bring uh, peace and harmony, to the United States, to restore race relations, to repair our approach to the environment and things like that. Um, Leary was a careening madman in terms of destabilizing a lot of the situation and promoting discord, actually. And you, as you probably know, and this is the biggest rap on Tim Leary, is that we are just now beginning to really study psychedelics, which can be incredibly therapeutic and beneficial to people. Tim Leary set back the cause of that 50 years because he basically, more than anybody else, was single handedly responsible for demonizing psychedelics because of what he had unleashed through his own careless use. And let's be honest that Tim Leary was an alcoholic and he was a narcissist. He had some sociopathic tendencies. And you could say in a lot of ways that he was on a nonstop party, and LSD is what fueled a lot of his party. And he was incredibly charismatic and knew how to make people feel good who were around him and lift them up with him. So he could be so joyful that it really kind of disguised a lot of what was going on. But there's a case to be made. Robert Greenfield wrote a biography of Tim Leary his whole life. Our book is about these 28 months in Leary's life and how it intersects with Richard Nixon and the US government. But you can make a case that Timothy Leary is like, one of the worst things that happened to the 60s movement. And so was that intentional? Was he working for the US government in some way? I've never seen any documents about that, and I would be surprised if that was the case. And I will tell you that the documents I've seen are basically from Tim Leary's own archives. We requested when we began working on this book in 2014, FBI files, CIA files, all that stuff, you name it. The status of that request um, has never been filled. We've gotten letters saying, uh, these files are moved to this place. You can file a request at this other National Archives unit, which we've done. And then we get letters saying, well, we're working on the request. We have a big backlog. And of course, the Leary papers, I mean, the FBI files should be digitally available at this point. And those are almost impossible to get. But we were really lucky, Robbie, because Tim Leary had some really good lawyers, right? And those lawyers had earlier requested copies of Tim Leary's FBI and CIA files and State Department files. And actually, I will say we did get some State Department files, which because they were tracking him internationally. That's where you could see that the government was basically just blowing off its foreign policy objectives to just do whatever it could to grab Leary, no matter how messy it got, interfering in other countries' internal business. But what I'm getting at is that Tim Leary's own papers, which is the New York Public Library, do have his FBI files, the bulk of them. So they are available to researchers, but good luck getting any of that stuff from the government.
Why do you think they're keeping that? Like, I don't think he's a double agent. I just look at it like if you're dealing with a domestic issue, you would try and buy up or you would try and communicate and get them on your side, the person that would probably be throwing the biggest hamper out there. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, it's just a smart tactic. You wouldn't go straight to just trying to demonize this person unless you can somehow communicate with him and tell him, hey, slow it down. Like do something like that. But I mean, I've heard the bad stuff about him, and I don't know if that's how history remembers him. Like I said, I'm very new to Timothy Leary, but I've came across books that talk about his whole horrible side, and then I've talked to people that have only really briefly mentioned the positives that he's done with LSD, which makes him such an enigma, kind of in my mind, because I don't know. He's like an Oswald. I don't know. Is he intelligence or is he not? Like I just don't know. Like somebody give me the conclusive document that shows the proof of this.
He was a free agent, and he was working for Timothy Leary. at all times. And and honestly, if people were approaching him in that way, and I bet you're right that he was approached more than once. A couple of things to keep in mind. One is it would have been in person, not in anything in writing, and the other is that Tim Leary he was an unstable personality. You could not count on him to do anything other than to pursue his own kind of hedonistic self-interest. So
Well, he was the wait, if he said, "Tune in, drop out," he's not the person so, wait, did he create the set and setting? Because that just sounds like a conflict if we talk about him just carelessly giving drugs out, like, you would think it would be a setting thing as well too, go back to his actual statement.
no, he no, and I'm sorry, I wasn't clear about that. He did always in public counsel the need for set and setting, and but there were mixed messages because he was also saying, turn on, tune in, and drop out. Um, and there, so on the one hand, you're hearing, you know, yes, use the Tibetan Book of the Dead or whatever, and like the candles and have a guide and all that. But the other, it was just basically, free yourself, do what you need to free yourself. And, that's what a lot of people did. And, honestly, when you're talking to adolescents, he was reaching people who were between 13 and 23 primarily. And these are not people who are like known for having an abundance of caution in their personal lives, because that's when you're at the height of your risk taking years. I mean, you were wired to take risk at that age. So,
When it comes to Nixon's extent, so you mentioned a little bit about like some of the how far he was willing to go with it. But when did they actually like, actually get, I mean, what like document wise? I mean, if they're keeping tabs on them, if they're watching them, and you got some documents, small documents compared to the stuff that you did ask for that you couldn't get. I mean, I'm just curious to what are they keeping on Timothy Leary that could be of importance? Like what they had to be surveilling him if they have documents to hide, right? They couldn't just be writing files about a person that they can't see or not watching.
right. Yeah. Honestly, I'm not sure there's a whole lot out there. I think what we got from Tim Leary's personal archive, which again, he had great lawyers. They got basically everything they could from the government years ago. There probably are some other things scattered here and there, and there may be some smoking gun things, but I think probably what they would be reluctant to reveal, as they always are in FBI files, are their methods and sources, and that's what they tend to sort of line through or mark through whenever you do get FBI files. So,
Did you come across any personal letters or writings of Timothy Leary?
oh yeah,
Did
yeah,
he
no,
have any paranoia in him?
not really. I mean, that's one of the, he's uh, not a lot, honestly. He was tripping almost all the time. I mean, taking acid basically every day for months on end.
That's my biggest nightmare.
So he had, and for him at that point, you do develop a tolerance. So he's basically like microdosing every day. But if anybody else like was chugging the amount of LSD he did, I mean, they would lose their minds. So, and I think he liked being around people who were losing their minds while he was in control.
Did he like start to develop like a cult following in a sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
That was the thing is, yeah, there were, when he got fired from Harvard, a very wealthy friend had an estate, a large estate called Millbrook in New York. And Larry moved his operations there. And it was, this beautiful, I don't even remember how many acres it was, but, big palatial house, all kinds of grounds and waterfalls and park-like setting. And people would make the pilgrimage there to basically conduct experiments with LSD, but it was basically a big party scene, like it always was around Timothy Leary.
Like Burning Man.
Yeah, yeah,
When
exactly.
so what happened to Timothy? Like how did he die?
So Leary, well, he did end up being captured in Kabul, Afghanistan, in January 1973 after this chase across, first, through the Western U.S. and then to Algeria, and then he was in Europe, in Switzerland for a while, and then to Lebanon, and then ended up in Afghanistan, and that's where he got nabbed. and he was brought back to the U.S. He was, I think, the amount, the bail that was set for him was the highest bail in U.S. history for any individual. I can't remember now how much it was. It was like, I don't know, like $50 million at that time or something like that, January 1973. I mean, much higher bail than anybody like, say, Charles Manson or anybody like that. This guy who had never, ever been even accused of doing anything violent. He had been in prison for having two joints, and to be fair to him, those joints were half smoked. They weren't even full joints. So
Was that just where he got caught is why that's the law there, or is that just like trying to target somebody and take them out?
I'm sorry.
Is
Uh,
that like where the law was, where he got caught with those joints? Is that like, because you can go to Singapore, you'll be killed for marijuana. That's a death sentence, basically. You can't do that to that country. But, or were they like, was he already aware that the government was after him and trying to lock him up? And that's why the two joints, like Abraham Bolden got pardoned recently because of Biden. But you could say he was locked up on trumped up charges.
yeah, I got you. Okay. Yeah. So Tim Leary, he knew the government was after him. He was already under indictment for uh, smuggling some pot into Texas from Mexico. Um, and so he was already in legal trouble. He already knew he was being targeted. But Tim Leary, personal discipline was not one of his character traits. And he's in Laguna Beach, California, um, and he was in his family station wagon, and he was not a cautious person. So yeah, there were two joints in the ashtray of the station wagon when the cop pulled up and busted him for those. So yeah, he should have known better. But so anyway, so when he got caught and he came back, yeah, there were I don't remember how many charges there were, but it was a big victory for the government, and their idea was to put him behind bars forever. And what happened is that Eldridge Cleaver, I mentioned earlier, the Black Panther leader, also had been arrested by that time. They actually ended up in prison together. But Leary, his sentence was later reduced to a great deal. And this gets into him turning government agent, which apparently in prison, he did provide information to the FBI about the Weather Underground. Those people had never been caught for those bombings and things like that. And Tim Leary had an inside look at their operation. They sprung him from prison, and the government put a lot of pressure on him to reveal what he knew. And apparently he did. So, yeah, there's that to add to his list of uh, moral turpitude.
Did you find out anything I would say that was like, I mean, difficulty, I guess, writing your book? I mean, when you're finding out documents and kind of looking through even Timothy Leary's lawyer's files, did you have any conflicts? Anything that kind of you either didn't understand or you just couldn't agree with?
You mean in like in what way?
Well, I mean, like when you're, like I said, going into the beginning of the book, for instance, you kind of are going to write about Nixon, you're going to write about Timothy Leary, but then towards the ending, I mean, did you start off on the same foot that you started on?
Yeah, Timothy Leary is such an interesting person because when I was 18 years old and I was in college and I was experimenting with psychedelics, Timothy Leary was the guy. He had this wonderful smile, he was handsome and he looked vigorous. He looked like a just retired tennis pro. And it was like, an advertisement for LSD. It was like, hey, you can live the good life like me. And everybody, myself and everybody, looked up to him as this guy who uh, was against the establishment. He was preaching that we should free our minds and really find out what the universe is all about instead of believing all the bullshit we've been taught in school. And so it was like a personal liberation that he was preaching. And that is why a lot of people, myself included, revered Timothy Leary. Well, revere is maybe a strong word, but looked up to Timothy Leary. Some people did revere him, and he did have a cult around him. But he was seen as a real marketer for what the '60s generation stood for and what it represented to all of us who I came of age after the '60s. I was like, man, I just missed out on all the good times, but hey, you can still do LSD and kind of experience the tail end of it in some ways. So that's the public Timothy Leary that a lot of people know, and that was the public Timothy Leary that a lot of people admired. and had been mistreated by the government for being arrested and thrown in jail. But you just have to get a little bit beneath the surface. And I mentioned Robert Greenfield's biography of Timothy Leary is it's a real reality check. It's a pretty negative portrait of Leary that emerges. And when I read that biography, you don't come away liking Timothy Leary because you see that he was basically probably had some sociopathic tendencies. He was a narcissist, and he was on a lifelong journey to enrich Timothy Leary's own personal experience at the expense of everything else. He was just looking out for number one.
Uh,
Um,
that's why I wanted to bring that up was because you mentioned it probably hindered the progress of psychedelics for treatment for 50 years because of Timothy Leary. And a lot of people like the thing is, I don't have a bias in this. Like I don't have a dog in the fight, so I'm going to talk to both sides, obviously. And the side I've talked to so far has always praised Timothy Leary. And I was curious to, we get the public opinion. A lot of people get the public view of stuff, and then you've dive deeper with your book, you've dived into documents, you've seen stuff, and you kind of get this different perspective than probably what the general public hears about or knows about if they do hear of them. And it can challenge a lot of things, especially, I mean, if you're a young kid hearing stories about Timothy Leary, and seeing him basically say like, "Hey, free your mind." That's a good sell today. A lot of people would be like, "Yeah, that's great," but I mean, is it 100% true? And then, I mean, you can rationalize Nixon's choices as well too, and just the American government. I mean, he did cause some people to go crazy, and it was a risky care use of LSD, not in the sense of maybe everybody didn't have a positive reaction on that.
yeah, no, those are such good points. And you made me think too that Leary was really, I'm being largely negative in my assessment of him, but let's look at it from the other perspective because honestly, you can question in hindsight anything anybody did, and you can always find, well, these negative things happen as a result of this of what this guy did. But let's look at it from the other perspective. Let's say that at that time LSD was very, very tightly controlled when Larry first started using it. It was only given to the elite people, and the great unwashed, the bulk of America had no access to this potentially mind altering, liberating drug. And and also let's point out that a lot of people have used LSD, myself included, but you can look at people like Steve Jobs who've talked about this on and on and on. A lot of creative people, a lot of,
Carrie Mullis.
there you go. They say that that's one of the most significant spiritual experiences of their life because what they learned while they were on the drug. So now, Timothy Leary is the guy who opened the keys to that cabinet and handed it all out to the rest of us. Bad things happen to some as a result. Terrifying things happen to a lot, and a lot of other things happen. But was that the wrong choice that he made? I don't know. I mean, you can make an argument the other way that there are literally millions of people who had one of the most significant spiritual experiences of their lives as a result. So, and they may not have had those otherwise. So,
It's a moral question. I mean, you can examine him like Prometheus who steals the fire for all the mortals and then gets punished, but you can also look at it like, I mean, was he stealing fire or was he stealing basically a plague? I mean, how many people were going to be introduced to this drug and are really shit? That's why I don't do drugs, is because my first interactions were in the worst possible scenarios to ever smoke or do any drugs in. And then I just didn't like it. So I was like, no, it's not for me. And, it's not for everybody, but, that never really gets brought up. Usually when you hear about drugs in popular culture, it kind of talks about it's everybody can have this amazing experience. And it might just be necessarily that one individual.
yeah, that's a good point. And also you think of what the great folklorist Joseph Campbell said. There are many paths to the same Godhead, and this like quasi-religious experience that you might have on LSD or a religious experience is something that can be replicated many other ways, and probably many more uh, time-honored ways of approaching that mystical state. There are traditions where people do it through drumming or through immersion in some aspect of nature, things like that. There are other substances that are much safer that can be used. Meditation, of course, is probably the biggest way. So, it doesn't have to be LSD, but I think it is good. And I appreciate what you say too, because uh, you know, and I say Timothy Leary is like kind of the prototypical American in some ways because it was like, hey, you want to change your life? Take this pill, you'll have instant change, right? And that's that, and also the freedom to do whatever the hell we want. Those two things played into the great LSD experimentations that was unleashed as a result. And that's really American approach to doing stuff. Instant gratification and instantly change your mind, and nobody tells you what to do. You do whatever the hell you want.
There's definitely when you look at especially a lot of stuff during the Cold War, even earlier than that, you can look at Johnson's administration, you can look at Nixon's administration. When you hear the history part of it, and then you kinda try and examine both sides of it, I mean, you can justify kind of both sides. I mean, I'm looking more at the government aspect right now where I've trust me, I've done plenty of episodes that talk about anti-establishment, but then you look at how they're viewing it, like how Alan Dulles views things or how just anybody that's doing an action, you start going, "Well, this person's thinking about, like" they're looking at this like an enemy thing, and we're looking at it from a different perspective, and I guess that's that how much the government knows compared to the general public. Like most audiences, we don't see the espionage warfare during the Cold War. We don't know all these tactics. We don't know about the CIA working with the mafia. We don't know any of these types of stuff. So when you find out the documents to it, you start hopping down that conspiracy train a little bit. You can get really revved up and be upset. Like most people are upset. Tupac Shakur, all these types of things that start going in. But then you got to examine it from the other aspect as well too. Like I learned more about Alan Dulles, and I considered him the person that made the order to take out Kennedy. But then you kind of look at how he views things, and it was like I have to do what most people won't do to save America from communism. And you just like, oh God, I just tried to hate you, and now I'm looking at it like you're just thinking about it a lot differently than how we're viewing it, reading it.
You asked about if Timothy Leary was paranoid. How paranoid do you think Alan Dulles was?
Oh, he was in charge of MK Ultra with Richard Helms. I bet he was very paranoid.
Yeah, and just that whole idea, um, it's like a lot of wars. I mean, let's say you start off saying, "Hey, we're going to oppose communism." Pretty soon, everything that you oppose becomes communism, whether it's communism or not. And that actually is sets you on a path to evil. You know,
Well, I bet it was I mean, did you see or did you notice anything that kinda confirmed, I guess, this point that I'm about to say, which is, like, you don't notice that you're doing evil when you're around it for so long? Like, we know about the Watergate stuff and William Colby exposing the stuff that was going on with Watergate, and just because he said he wanted to, make the CIA better, he didn't want it to he thought they're going down a wrong path, and it's kinda like I mean, we all have crappy routines. For instance, people smoke cigarettes, and to someone who doesn't smoke cigarettes, that's new and that's disgusting. But to that person, they probably smoked for however long, and it's normal to them where they don't even think about it. They'll light it up in the middle of a restaurant. And so, like, you can't do that here. Look at it for the government. Look at it, Timothy Leary taking drugs and not noticing he has two joints in his, cup holder. It's so normal to him. He doesn't see the issue. And that's the thing is like how there's like each guess individuals' lives, even with the government as well too. People doing certain acts or certain things that could be seen as unethical, but you don't know because you're around it, you're doing it. You don't notice the evil if you're or whatever's bad to another person who's never experienced that before.
yeah, and yeah, I'm sure that's true. The normalization of evil, and I would say there's a big difference between Timothy Leary's two joints, which he would argue would not hurt anybody but himself, and that even compared to somebody lighting up a cigarette in a restaurant where secondhand smoke, you know, does affect others, and then you get to some of the operations the U.S. government was carrying out, which, in my estimation, those were actively hurting people uh, domestically and in other countries, and really hurting the long-term interests of the United States by empowering dictatorial regimes that repressed their own citizens and in many cases murdered their own citizens who were interested only in democracy and human justice. So, there's a whole scale of things. And I think that, anybody has any kind of ethical training, it's hard to go against any system that you're in. I mean, you know, it's so easy to go back and condemn people in the past. But you could look at how we live now. start up our car and drive 5 blocks to the store, or you know, get a plastic bag at the grocery store, you drink water out of a plastic bottle or whatever. I mean, all that stuff contributes to really kind of very negative effects in the world that we take all of it for granted.
Well, I mean, even look at the example of what you mentioned with Timothy Leary thinking that he's giving all the keys to everyone to go explore this new, mind altering thing. I bet, if it went a different way and he wasn't, arrested or any of that, that could have been a whole different society that we lived in. I mean, could we have gotten to psychedelic drugs faster, or did it delay the progress? I mean, there's many of that aspects of things I think you got to keep in mind, especially like, I mean, today we're just disconnected from everything, which is just interesting to me of why I'm getting fascinated with history, because psychedelics still involved around back then, the war on terror, war on drugs, whatever you want to say. It's a new form today, but people are still thinking the same. The long history of people questioning or being involved, whether it's propaganda that the government gives you or propaganda against the other side. I mean, this idea of patriotism, everything, it's still here. It's just in many different forms, which I think makes, my generation probably has an existential crisis on the whole historical thing in America and all that. But there's so many relatable tactics all throughout American history and just all throughout history in general. There's roots there, and you just kind of have to notice it. It's just in a different form. It's about taking that modern perspective and going back to more of a past one.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and a really good observation too. And it makes you think about Mark Twain's famous quote that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
That's a good one. I've never heard of that.
It is a great quote, and it's true. I mean, you see these pendulum swings and these kinds of reactions and counter reactions just happen over and over. And it is really, to me, it's really interesting to go back and see how previous generations dealt with a lot of the same scenarios and how they managed to change things for the better, or how things got worse, and to try to avoid those mistakes or learn from the positive lessons that you can take.
Now, the not microdocking, but the Weather Underground. When did they phase out?
Oh, let's see. Oh, I could have told you that back when this book came out. It was all really fresh in my mind,
I'm
but
sorry.
no, it's okay. So the Weather Underground, wow, they're still around. The founders, as far as I know, are still with us. Um, they've never served any jail time. They were actually the people involved in the Weather Underground tended to be upper middle class kids who were elite college students, and they were really became active in the late '60s and the early '70s. And at some point, there were some terrible things happen. The only people who got killed by the Weather Underground bombs were actually members of the Weather Underground themselves,
That's when a bomb blew up in a building, right, and killed 4 of them?
in Greenwich Village. Exactly, yeah. And but the survivors managed to avoid prosecution from the FBI. The FBI, the government just never had enough physical evidence really, to connect them all, and a lot of circumstantial evidence. And they also had really good lawyers. And so one of them, Bill Ayers from Chicago, became famous later because he had attended a fundraiser with a young state senator in Illinois named Barack Obama in those years. So Obama was tied into this terrorist group and so forth. But by that point, Bill Ayers was a respected, I believe he was a professor at that time. His one-time wife in the Weather Underground, Bernadine Dorn, was also, I think she was a professor for sure, but she was doing early childhood education and stuff. People age out of violent warfare at some point, and these are people again who the template for their lives was to be upper middle class, and they kind of reverted to that form. And so, essentially, by I'm going to say the mid '70s or so, that whole campaign that they had done, where they were doing bombings of government installations, really began to fade out. Um, and I'll mention that the government had its own name for the Weather Underground because one of their big stunts was they had placed a bomb in the one of the restrooms in the U.S. Capitol that went off, and that was like to them a huge accomplishment. We bombed the Capitol to show how opposed we are to the Vietnam War. But what they did is they blew up a commode, you know, And so the government was calling them the toilet bombers, basically. So
That's still scary though.
no, it is scary, yeah, and they called in warnings before the bombs to everything evacuated. It's all these were it was basically a PR campaign with violence. It was like, hey, everybody, media and everybody, this bomb's going to go off in the Capitol in 5 hours. Go check it out.
Oh, so kind of like sending a message, but not hurting anybody involved in it. Just being like, see, we can get you anywhere, that type of deal.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Yeah, it was a way to draw attention to their opposition to the Vietnam War, and to show that the government that they were vulnerable. Yeah.
Did they mention or did you come across any connections why the Weather Underground liked Timothy Leary so much? Like, was it just because they were giving him drugs or?
Oh, good question. And let me mention too that there is a very good book that came out right before our book, and it's on the Weather Underground. It's called Days of Rage, and it's brought by a terrific writer based in Texas named Brian Burrow. Days of Rage, and the Weather Underground connection with Tim Leary is basically the Weather Underground. They were not druggies. They were not like hippies. They were like militant uh, opponents of the Vietnam War. They were highly disciplined, highly regimented, and very tactical, and with a lot of planning into all of their campaigns they carried out. There's a reason why they never got caught, because they were really smart and they knew how to outwit a bunch of bumbling middle-aged FBI agents who were career bureaucrats. Honestly, I mean, these were really smart college kids. And anyway, they there was a lot of debate about whether or not they should come to Tim Leary's aid, because when Tim Leary was put in prison, he and his advocates were basically saying, "We got to get our hero out of prison, right?" Tim Leary had a very good attorney, a radical attorney, uh, uh, William Kennedy, was that his name? Who was the same attorney that the Weather Underground used, and it was that attorney who basically negotiated the uh, the arrangement by which the Weather Underground broke Leary out of prison. They did it for money. They got a shitload of money for doing that. And the people who gave them the money was this group in California known as the Brotherhood of Eternal Love.
Oh God, I've heard them.
Yeah, basically LSD commune sort of group. And yeah, they sold a bunch of pot and acid and used the money and delivered it to the Weather Underground. And the Weather Underground said, "Okay, we have the money. We'll break your guy out of jail now." So
That's
it's a
that
great story.
that's crazy, man.
Let me just say, when I read Robert Greenfield's biography of Timothy Leary, because like a lot of people, it's like, oh, I'm interested in this guy. And I read the biography, and it was dispiriting to read because you see like what a shithole Tim Leary was. But there's one short chapter in there about his escape from prison and his life on the lam. And I just read this, I don't know, 12 or 13 page chapter, whatever it was. And I just thought, my God, there's a story there. 1969, 1973 is a fascinating time in America. And Tim Leary was on the lam. I had no idea. And I've talked to so many people who know about Tim Leary and just don't even remember that he was ever in jail and busted out. Oh, because you asked a long time ago how he, when he died and all that. He basically got out of prison and rehabilitated his image and published a memoir called Flashbacks, and was on the celebrity lecture circuit, and was Hollywood parties and all that, and basically lived until about 1996. So yeah, he went out basically a Hollywood celebrity
Why does everybody go on a book tour?
to sell books.
I
If you
guess that's makes
if you
sense.
spend all these hours writing books, you hope you'll sell a few of them at least.
But
Yes.
gee, if you're that, I guess, antagonistic of the government, you would think that you probably just lay low for the rest of your life.
Oh, he was toothless by then. Yeah, we're talking 1980s, 1990s. And he was just this old guy who stood a big smile, and yeah, he was not really. We had other things to worry about at that point in society.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Davis, I appreciate the time you've given me, be able to learn a little bit about what you wrote about and also learn about Timothy Leary. Is there a place where people can find your books and also any other links that you have?
Wherever you get your books, you can find this book. I'm sure it's still in print. It's called The Most Dangerous Man in America, which we didn't mention this, but that is what Richard Nixon supposedly called Timothy Leary, the most dangerous man in America. But yeah, wherever you can get books. I have a website, stephenldavis.org, and You can probably find a little bit more about the book there, but honestly, just whatever search engine you prefer would work for you as well too.
It's got a beautiful cover.
Oh yeah,
The color clashing or just the colors in general is just very good, yeah.
yeah, that's the paper. Yeah, I like that paperback cover. The hardback cover is kind of boring. It's like this picture of Timothy Leary going. I guess he's deep in thought, but doesn't look very dangerous. He looks more sleepy. But yeah, I love the paperback. Glad you saw that.
Well, I'm gonna link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.